thank you, everybody, and thank you all for coming. This is really a big audience. Wasn't expecting that. So today is going to be kind of an interesting mixture of biodiversity and climate change. And the way I see these two global crises intersecting the deep ocean. So I'll talk at first about deep sea biodiversity. Some of you know almost more about it than I do, actually, but I'll talk a little bit about evolution and adaptation and the important roles that deep ocean biodiversity plays in the carbon cycle and in our climate. And then I plan to talk about threats to that biodiversity from resource extraction and from climate change, and then how some of the climate solutions being proposed also might threaten biodiversity in the deep sea. And I'll talk about the juxtaposition of deep-seabed mining and marine geoengineering a bit, and then close by discussing some of the pathways we have to biodiversity and carbon conservation through the United Nations agencies. So to start, I think everybody's familiar with the fact that we have many global crises on this planet in the arenas of climate and biodiversity, food, energy, waste, human health. Our crises abound, but today I would like to just focus on two of these, climate and the juxtaposition of these two is not new. In about 2019 and 2020, the IPBES, which is a global assessment focused on biodiversity, and the IPCC, which is a global assessment focused on climate change, held a joint meeting, a series of joint meetings, actually. And the report that emerged points out that climate change impacts and biodiversity loss are two of the most important challenges and risks for human society. The report states that limiting global warming to ensure a habitable climate and protecting biodiversity are mutually supporting goals, and that their achievement is essential for sustainably and equitably providing benefits to people. Now, policies for these two crises have largely tackled the problems independently, climate change and biodiversity. There's different agencies, different governance. So they've been addressed separately, but this report points out that policies that simultaneously address synergies between mitigating biodiversity loss and climate change while also considering their societal impacts offer the opportunity to maximize co-benefits and help meet development aspirations for all. So this report says almost very little about the deep ocean, but it does bring together these two crises. So what does this have to do with the deep ocean? Well, we know that society increasingly is addressing the deep ocean, engaged in the deep ocean, extracting resources from the deep ocean, and the many different ways we engage are shown up here, from our scientific study of projecting and modeling climate change to projecting hazards, extracting energy from deep oil and gas or wind, extracting fisheries resources, potentially seabed mining, and climate interventions, which I'll talk about, all have to do with the deep sea in some way or another. So when I refer to the deep sea, I'm referring to the ocean below 200 meters. This covers about, in surface area, about 2/3 of our planet. But it is, I will point out that although we tend to talk about the deep sea as a single ecosystem, we say the deep sea, not the deep seas. It's actually, I don't know why my computer's advancing by itself, but we really need to recognize that it is not a single ecosystem, that we have oxygen minima zones along continental margins. We have canyons and fjords. We have that are by the hundreds to really thousands along our continental margins. We have tens of thousands of seamounts. We have hundreds of cold water coral and sponge reefs, some that can be kilometers in size. We have vast abyssal plains. We have whale falls, uncounted numbers of hundreds of whale fall ecosystems. And we have other chemosynthetic ecosystems like methane seeps and hydrothermal vents that rely on chemosynthesis rather than photosynthesis. We have trenches that cover something like 2% of our deep sea. And then we have the deep pelagic, which unfortunately I list here as one ecosystem, but those of you who work in the water column know that there are also many different vertical layers and different ecosystems in the water column. So the deep sea is very, very heterogeneous. And each of these ecosystems has its own biodiversity and its own species that are highly adapted to extreme conditions in many cases. And these adaptations provide what I call superpowers to the organism. So we have animals in the deep sea that can tolerate the highest temperatures known. I think 55 degrees centigrade, like the alvinellid polychaetes. We have animals in the deep sea that can live at pH of 5 or even less. We have at some hydrothermal vents. We have animals at methane seeps that can tolerate sulfide levels of 5 millimolar or more. We have animals that can live at less than 1% oxygen saturation in the deep sea. And we have animals that can live at 800 to 1,000 atmospheres of pressure at depths of 10,000 meters or more. So we have an amazing array of evolutionary adaptations. Some of the other interesting superpowers, we have animals with symbionts that can digest wood. We have animals with other symbionts that can digest whale bones. But my favorite superpowers are the power of longevity. We have fish that typically live in the deep ocean for 100, 150, maybe even 200 years of age. These are all commercially harvested fish that I've put up here. The oldest known fish is the Greenland shark. It can live to 300 or 400 years old. We have seep tube worms that can live to 300 years old, but these are all babies compared to deep sea corals that can live for thousands of years, 2,000, 4,000 years, maybe even more. And the oldest known living animals are some of the sponges, which can live for 17 or 18,000 years of age. We've also discovered that the deep ocean is full of unexpected habitat support in the form of providing substrate and nursery grounds and refuge and food web support. We've found that some of the sponges off Canada can provide rockfish nursery grounds. We've discovered that small fish larvae can live in amongst the stinging tentacles of sea pens in sea pen fields, also off Canada. Just in the last few years, we've discovered octopus gardens where hundreds of octopus will brood their young in warm, diffuse flow on seamounts. And an octopus will sit for 3 to 4 years without moving, brooding its young. We've discovered that skates and rays can lay their egg cases at hydrothermal vents and methane seeps. We still don't exactly understand why. In some cases, there's warmer temperatures, but in some cases, maybe they're getting protection from hydrogen sulfide. We find other cases like, let's see if my pointer will work. We find corals providing nursery grounds for very, very tiny galatheid crabs. And this recent discovery we made that giant single-celled animals called foraminifera, called xenophyophores, which agglutinate sediments, provide nursery habitat to snailfish embryos, which are laid deep inside the structure. I think that's so cool, having a fish use a protozoan as a nursery habitat. And we've come to understand biodiversity as an ecosystem service. So beyond the many species The genetic resources out there are provide the potential for life in the ocean to adapt to change, basically a living library. There's enzyme diversity that we've tapped for creating cold water detergents and UV-resistant chemicals. We know that many deep sea organisms, especially among the sponges and maybe some others, produce metabolites that can provide antibiotics or anti-cancer or anti-inflammatory agents. We're increasingly tapping deep sea species as biomaterials. The sponge fibers have very interesting optical properties. Bamboo corals have been used as a template for bone grafts. The scaly-foot snail has been used as, its scales have been used as a template for different kinds of armor and airplane hulls and car exteriors and so on. We have anti-fouling chemicals and detoxification chemicals for methylmercury. There are cellulases and pyrrolases that have been used for various applications. The blood of tube worms has been examined as a potential template for artificial human blood. Some of the microbes in the deep sea are really good at scrubbing CO2 and so potential climate solutions. So these are just some examples of the way that deep sea biodiversity can provide a service to humans. We also know that biodiversity contributes to carbon sequestration and nutrient cycling. The biological pump provides carbon removal, transport, vertical transport, transformation, and ultimately burial and sequestration. And we also know that the deep ocean, it takes up a significant amount of heat from, well, the ocean itself takes up a lot of heat, and some of that ends up in the deep ocean. But beyond the biological pump and the passive processes, which are dependent on circulation and small particles, we're coming to recognize that the big organisms in the ocean also play important roles in carbon cycling. So we have diurnal vertical migrations of small fish and plankton that move carbon from surface waters into the deep sea every single day. These are the largest migrations on the planet, billions of organisms. We have fish holding, and marine mammals hosting large amounts of carbon in their tissues, so there's carbon storage there. We have whales moving carbon from deep water up, well, from the surface to the deep sea, but also they bring feed in deep water and then defecate in surface waters and release nutrients that fuel primary production. There are food webs that move carbon down into the deep sea. And then we have large mammals that when they die, they fall to the deep ocean and bring carbon down. So there are many different contributions of marine biodiversity to the carbon cycle. But if you notice, this image here, like the one I showed you previously, shows the sea floor as a flat brown line, right? Nothing's there, no life. And that's probably a mistake, and I'll explain why it actually matters. Basically, all of the ecosystems that I've been talking about on the seafloor also provide very important carbon services. So I've already talked about the vertical transport of carbon that happens in the water column, but in the deep sea, we have habitats along the continental margins that sequester huge amounts of carbon. Our canyons, some of our cold water coral and sponge reefs, our oxygen minimum zones all have very high carbon content, and then the abyssal plains are so vast that by their hugeness, they sequester a large amount of carbon. Seamounts are sites of animal aggregation, so there's a lot of biomass carbon sequestration that goes on. And then the chemosynthetic environments play different roles. So for example, at methane seeps, methane is a very potent greenhouse gas, 20 times more potent than carbon dioxide. And the microbes and animals that live there filter out that methane and either turn it into tissue or turn it into rock. They produce carbonate. the microbes do, and sequester that carbon so it doesn't enter the atmosphere. And then at hydrothermal vents, we have the hot fluids bringing iron and other nutrients into the ocean, and they act as a fertilizer that allows phytoplankton to fix carbon and produce the biological pump and sequester more carbon. So it's all very interconnected, but the deep sea floor plays a critical role. Deep sea biodiversity also has a series of cultural ecosystem services. They take the form of education and scientific research. The deep sea provides space for laying communication cables. It's the inspiration for film and art and literature, and to a lesser extent, tourism. Let's see if I don't have the cultural, the spiritual services on there. I think they come in a little bit later. But it's important to point out that our scientific knowledge base derives from studying less than 10%, probably less than 5% of the deep ocean, at least in terms of the ocean floor, and much less than that, probably in terms of the water column. And this means that most species on the planet remain undiscovered, or at least most species in the deep ocean remain undiscovered and undescribed. And yet this biodiversity that we are just beginning to know is already under threat from bottom trawling, from energy extraction, from contamination, and overfishing, and mine tailing disposal, and potentially seabed mining, and certainly from climate change. And so I'm going to talk in more detail about these. You know, all of these different types of human threats bring disturbance with them. They cause physical disruption, resuspended sediments, changes in substrate, and release of contaminants, often leading to loss of biological structures and changed food webs. So fishing, for example, over the decades of this century, we've been fishing continually deeper and deeper. This is most evident in the Antarctic, but it's happening everywhere. And deep water fishing has led, in many cases, to overfishing of long-lived, slow-reproducing fish species. It's also led to loss of gear on the seafloor, which yields ghost fishing, where the gear continues to collect and trap fish that are never recovered. And we also have bycatch associated with deep water fisheries, where many species become endangered, not because they're the target of fisheries, but because they're accidentally caught at the same time. So this has happened a lot in the North Atlantic. I think there are at least 15 endangered deep sea species as a result of bycatch. And then, of course, bottom fishing, which involves the towing of very large trawls over the seafloor, runs inevitably sort of flattens and levels and turns the three-dimensional structures on the seabed to rubble. And now I think we're starting to realize that bottom trawling also is releasing carbon dioxide from the seabed as it moves through. We recognize that our deep water coral and sponge ecosystems are a bit like rainforests, but of the deep ocean. The organisms are very long-lived. They host very high biodiversity. They have a lot of pharmaceutical potential, just like the rainforests, and they're extremely vulnerable to human disturbance, just as in the rainforest, right? Because these corals can live for hundreds, but often thousands of years. They're very easily damaged by bottom trawls, and it's very common to see scars and lost fishing gear and piles of rubble along our continental margins where deep sea fishing takes place. We are also continuing to extract, or I should say, we are moving our oil extraction into deeper and deeper water over time. There are something like 5,000 oil rigs in the Gulf of Mexico, and all of them that have been put out in the last 20 years are these big circles you see here. And And they're all in deep water, often down to 3,000 meters or more. And the most famous of these, the Deepwater Horizon, this diamond right here, blew out in 2010. And it helped us understand how awful these blowouts and accidents can be at contributing to loss of deep sea biodiversity. Often methane seeps are associated with oil and gas infrastructure, and the structures themselves and accidents risk damage to methane seeps and the carbon services. So as I mentioned, methane seeps are important in carbon capture and sequestration. They also host microbes that can degrade oil, and they're often very important sites for fisheries production. And at least in the Pacific, there are quite a few different commercially harvested species that aggregate and use methane seeps. Humans are also contaminating the deep ocean with pollution and plastics. Some of this involves intentional disposals, such as these DDT waste production barrels that were disposed of legally in the 1940s to 70s off Southern California in deep water. Some of it's unintentional, or probably these plastic bags off Costa Rica at 3,000 meters were dumped at sea, but some of it's unintentional. And we have a lot of microplastics in the ocean. The deepest organisms in the trenches are found to have high concentrations of PCBs and mercury. So basically, our contaminants can get any place in the ocean. Another threat that's emerging to deep sea biodiversity is deep-seabed mining. And this is the extraction of minerals, of seafloor minerals to obtain cobalt, nickel, copper, gold, silver, and other elements. Here's a picture of polymetallic nodules, which are of interest to miners in the Clarion-Clipperton zone. And recent research has shown that these nodules take 1 million years to form, and they host half of the biodiversity in that region. Seabed mining in international waters, which cover about 60% of the ocean, is managed through the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, or UNCLOS, Part 11. And UNCLOS basically declares the minerals on the seafloor to be the common heritage of mankind. That means that everybody owns them, you, me, and every country of the world in international waters, that they can be accessed only through the International Seabed Authority, and that the International Seabed Authority has to act for the benefit of humankind. It's also mandated through UNCLOS to adopt measures necessary to ensure effective protection of the marine environment from the harmful effects of mining. So it has the mandate to manage mining and give out exploration and exploitation contracts, and on the other hand, to protect the marine environment from mining. There are 3 major types of mineral resources of interest for mining in international waters. They include massive sulfides at hydrothermal vents. There are something like 400 known vents. They cover only a very small area of the ocean. Most of the known vents in international waters are actually under exploration contracts at the ISA now. 80% of the animals that occur at hydrothermal vents only live at hydrothermal vents. They have a very high level of evolutionary novelty, and thanks to some of the people in this room, there are now hydrothermal vent species that sit on the IUCN Red List, which means they're highly endangered. Another resource of interest are the cobalt-rich ferromanganese crusts, which occur mainly on seamounts between about 500 and 2,500 meters. The seamounts are sites of enhanced productivity and biomass, but also subject to a lot of fishing pressure because fish aggregate around these seamounts. They often have dense corals and sponges with genetic resources and are considered biodiversity hotspots. Those corals and sponges are often long-lived foundation species, and the seamount crusts form at a very slow rate. Like the polymetallic nodules, they can take millions of years to form. So once they're removed, they're not going to grow back quickly. And then the polymetallic nodules, which occur on vast areas of abyssal plains, are among the most biodiverse habitats on the planet, but most of the species still remain undescribed there. I mentioned the nodules take millions of years to form. Many of the animals that have been reported from these regions do not occur elsewhere. And as I said, half the species rely on the nodules themselves. And the animals, although we tend to focus on the ones we see in the videos like this, the majority of the biodiversity in these systems is very, very small. So I don't know if you know how big a US penny is. It's about so big. The majority of animals are much, much smaller than that, a fraction of a millimeter in size. So these are the 3 resources of interest for deep seabed mining. There are now 32 international exploration contracts led by the International Seabed Authority. The motivator for mining these is the metals needed for electric car batteries, for our electronics, and for the green energy revolution in general, or the green energy transition, I should say. There are other uses, but right now, these are argued to be the main motivators. And there are contracts in the West Pacific for seamounts mainly, in the Indian Ocean and North Atlantic for massive sulfides at hydrothermal vents, and a lot of contracts in the Clarion-Clipperton zone off Mexico in the Pacific for polymetallic nodules. So if we take a look at the Clarion-Clipperton zone contracts, you can see all these different countries have exploration contracts for mining listed up here. These hatch squares that surround them are the protected areas that have been designated as no mining areas surrounding them. But these contract areas are really huge. And just to give you an example of the size, 1 year of mining of a single contract would cover an area 2.5 times the size of Germany's largest coal mine. But to be economically viable, the companies have to mine for 20 to 30 years. And you can see how vast that area, 20 years of mining is going to cover an area, 100 by 100 kilometers. They're really, really huge areas. And again, most of the biodiversity there is undescribed, but where people have studied response to disturbance, and there were some disturbance experiments conducted 20 to 30 years ago, the research has shown that the biodiversity hasn't recovered after 25 years, for example. And that's true for all the size classes of organisms, including the microbes, where the microbial function hasn't recovered after all of those years. So we really run the risk of destruction of deep sea biodiversity before we totally discover and understand it. And there are some very specific taxa that have been put in danger, and Julia and others in this room, I think, were involved in, or probably responsible for making the scalyfoot snail the first IUCN red-listed species. It's found only in an area that has an exploration contract for mining. So it's very much endangered by mining. But there are the corals and other parts of the ecosystem are also in danger. And we're just starting now, as we worry about climate change and the carbon cycle, to ask how might mining affect the carbon cycle and climate. People recognize that mining will dig up and release carbon back into the water. In the deep sea, it is very likely to release sediment plumes and disruption to the animals that move carbon down through vertical migrations, but also to disrupt whales and turtles and other animals that move carbon horizontally across the basins. There is a certain amount of deep water carbon fixation that goes on, and we don't know how mining is going to disrupt that aspect of the carbon cycle. And then there was a paper that just came out a couple of months ago by Andrew Sweetman and co-authors that show that the polymetallic nodules seem to be producing oxygen in the deep sea. And we don't know how mining would disrupt that function. But that paper is probably most important for showing us that there are processes that we don't even know exist yet in the deep ocean. And then, not so much associated with climate, but we have come to understand that seabed mining also threatens various aspects of cultural heritage and traditional knowledge. There are indigenous peoples that believe their ancestors reside in the deep sea or that their people originated from the deep sea, and then the Middle Passage, which has a long history associated with slavery, also is highly vulnerable to mining. Now, a recent assessment led by Diva Ammon a few years ago demonstrated that we have many, many science gaps associated with deep seabed mining. Only 1%, basically, of the scientific topics assessed across mineral exploration contract areas had sufficient information to enable evidence-based management of deep seabed mining. So we really have a large number of knowledge gaps, yet people have begun to test mining equipment and mining methods. Some of our knowledge gaps I've listed here, and there are many. We have taxonomic and distribution gaps in knowledge. We know little about the life histories, longevity, and reproduction of most of the animals in areas targeted for mining. We're missing a lot of information about mid-water ecosystems above the mining areas and inactive hydrothermal vents. We're missing a lot of information from the Southern Hemisphere, connectivity information, knowledge of spatial and temporal variability, and information about ecosystem functions and services. And these are all basic science types of information that we need to actually manage mining. So some of the applied knowledge gaps for which we need that information revolve around the unknowns about the severity, implications, and mitigation of environmental impacts. We don't really know what constitutes serious harm, which is a legal term that the mining code tells us cannot occur. We don't have indicators of ecosystem health and threshold values for the harmful effects of the environment. These still need to be defined, and the ISA has been holding meetings to define them. We need information about the spatial extent of impacts, how ecosystem services are affected, the risk of extinction of species, how species could, or even if they could, recover from mining, and how we might remediate or restore. And personally, I actually think deep restoration is not a real thing for the deep sea, but some people will disagree with me. And cumulative impact. So there are so many gaps in knowledge, both basic and applied. And for this reason, there are now 32 countries, including Germany, that have signed on to a moratorium for deep seabed mining. You can see Germany's on the list. It was one of the first in this alliance. But there are 164 countries in the International Seabed Authority, so we are a very long way, or I would say these countries are a very long way from being able to have a real moratorium on mining. So mining has been put forward, especially most recently, as essential to providing minerals for electrification and the green transition. And I would like to just call that argument into question. The future demand for these minerals is somewhat uncertain, in part due to changing battery technology. Iron phosphate batteries are becoming a thing. They don't use any of the minerals being proposed for mining. And the Chinese car company, I think it's called BSR, but I've actually, BDR, I've forgotten the name of it. It uses iron phosphate batteries. It has 30% of the world market now. It's projected to have 40% of the world market by 2030. And if some of the other car companies adopt this, then we may not need the same number of minerals for electrification of our transport system, the same amounts. The other argument put forward is that deep seabed mining is more harmful than on land. And I guess I would also argue this, that most of the biodiversity in the deep sea has yet to be defined, but the areas that would be mined would be vast and would definitely create risk to that biodiversity. Mining has to go on for a long time to be profitable. It's really difficult to mine at 4,000 meters in the deep ocean. And again, it's one of our frontier ecosystems and one of the few that we haven't totally destroyed yet on this planet. So I think there are questions about deep seabed mining. And I want to now switch to talk a little bit about climate, and then I'll come back and bring these two themes together. We know that there are biodiversity threats from climate change, and that's because our ocean is our greatest climate mitigator. It's taken up 93% of excess heat from the atmosphere. That's led to changes in stratification and solubility that have led to massive loss of oxygen in the ocean. We call that ocean deoxygenation. And it's also led to reduced nutrients and productivity declines, and then less food for the deep sea in some areas. And the ocean is also taking up about just under a third of our carbon dioxide, and that's led to ocean acidification. And all of these things happen at the surface of the ocean, but they don't stay there. We have thermohaline circulation, the great conveyor belt, moving surface waters into the deep sea. So these waters are rapidly becoming warmer, more acidic, and less oxygenated. So warming in the deep ocean is happening. It's leading to changes in species distributions. Sometimes these are really dramatic, like the eastward movement of tuna in the Pacific is leading to economic losses for many of the island nations that rely on tuna. But it also is leading to changes in distributions, like invasion of the king crab into Antarctica from South America. And just when you have a major predator moving into a place that's getting warmer and now permits crustaceans that couldn't have been there before, we're seeing drops in biodiversity in the prey communities. Oxygen loss is leading to habitat compression. Some of the big fish, like tunas and billfish, are having to move into shallower water because oxygen minimum zones, midwater oxygen minimum zones are expanding. In some cases, we know oxygen declines lead to biodiversity loss or mass mortalities, or at least avoidance, which is causing the habitat compression. There are altered food webs, and where oxygen loss is very severe, there can be climate feedbacks, like the release of nitrous oxide, which is also a potent greenhouse gas. And then we know ocean acidification in the deep sea threatens calcifying organisms, like corals and bivalves, but is probably one of the biggest effects is probably the dissolution of the non-living components of coral reefs, which corals can actively counter acidification in some cases. It takes a lot of energy, but the non-living component, which is most of the deep water coral reef in many cases, will dissolve. And then we have a new threat. I'm not sure how many of you are familiar with the concept of marine carbon dioxide removal, but this is basically a new emerging industry that could affect the deep ocean. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change indicates we have to reach net zero or net negative CO2 emissions to achieve the goals of the Paris Agreement. And that to do this, it will require active carbon dioxide removal, including and this is mentioned in several reports, the 1.5 report, the most recent AR6 synthesis report, including from the ocean, but they mainly talk about active removal can occur on land or in the ocean. And it's important enough that the new IPC cycle, AR7, now has a report, an expert meeting and methodology report directly devoted to carbon dioxide removal. So while most of the efforts have been on land, people are now looking at a series of technologies that would remove carbon dioxide in the ocean. And many of these target the deep ocean as the repository. So I've listed over here a list of some of those many different technologies. Some of them are really focused on the coast, like coastal wetland restoration or blue carbon. Ocean alkalinity enhancement and direct CO2 removal are also largely coastal at the present time, whereas iron fertilization, artificial upwelling, seaweed cultivation and sinking, crop and wood waste disposal, and direct subsurface CO2 injection into deep water or below ground, below the deep water, are all considering the deep ocean as a repository for unwanted carbon dioxide. So the reason is that if we look at the global carbon cycle and where carbon is stored, in the atmosphere, on land, and in the ocean, by far the biggest repository of carbon is in the deep ocean. You can see huge numbers down here, especially in the water, not just in the sediments. And models tell us, Dave Siegel's models and others, that if you put carbon below 1,000 meters, it can stay out of the atmosphere for 100 or even 200 years. So this is a model of carbon deposited through the biological pump below 1,000 meters, and you can see that in the Pacific, in the northern Indian Ocean, in the Southern Ocean, the carbon sequestration times can be over 200 years. So there's a lot of interest in putting carbon in deep water. Now, the marine carbon dioxide removal is getting a lot of press. There are a lot of reports. People have drawn many, many schematics. And I'd like to just have you look at these images and notice what the bottom of the ocean looks like in these images. It's either like a black hole where there is nothing, or it's a flat gray or brown line where there is nothing, right? They don't talk about all those ecosystems and all the biodiversity that's down there that could be impacted by the deposition of this carbon. So I want to talk just a little bit about each of these technologies and how they might be affected. I'm thinking about the time here. I probably need to speed up a little bit, but there's a set of technologies, iron fertilization and artificial upwelling, that both involve introducing nutrients to stimulate phytoplankton growth, potentially enhancing atmospheric removal and subsequent sequestration into the deep sea. So the phytoplankton bloom and then they sink to the seafloor. Right now, it's very difficult to verify the fate of that carbon, and there are questions not only about effectiveness, but about the consequences for the ecosystem, because we know that sinking phytoplankton will lead to decay and drawdown of oxygen and release of carbon dioxide, essentially creating like a small oxygen minimum zones underneath that will then affect the distributions of plankton and natural sequestration processes. We don't know very much about whether they might release additional greenhouse gases like nitrous oxide and methane. And we don't know if the carbon actually will stay and make it down into the deep ocean or be moved. Some experiments have shown that iron fertilization can stimulate harmful algal blooms. And then there are models that show us that that there are different kinds of depletion of nutrients or nutrient robbing that can occur. For example, fertilizing the Southern Ocean can lead to nutrient deficiencies in the tropics, and that in turn can lead to lowered fish biomass and reduced fish catch in the tropics. So Tagliabue et al.'s models suggest that 92% of the countries that would actually have exacerbated climate change effects from iron fertilization and only a handful of countries would actually benefit from this, in terms of fish, at any rate. And I just wanted to share this movie. I came back from a cruise in June of this year. The movie was made at the end of May. off the Aleutian Islands. And this is basically a phytodetritus fall happening over a methane seep off the Aleutians. I'd never seen anything like this, but these are giant phytoplankton aggregates from a naturally occurring bloom sinking to the bottom. But I feel like this is this region is one of the areas targeted for iron fertilization. And I feel like we're looking at a natural experiment in place. And the bottom was covered with layers of phytodetritus aggregates. Organic matter sinking involves the culture and sinking of macroalgae, like kelps, or the gathering of naturally occurring algae like sargassum and sinking it to the bottom, or even the removal of wood and crop waste from land and sinking it into the deep sea. And some of these involve CO2 uptake from water in the case of algae, or CO2 uptake from air in the case of the wood and crops. But they share many different kinds of concerns, especially in terms of the scale of removal. None of these probably can achieve the many gigatons of carbon removal that we need to affect climate change. There's not enough areas with high nutrients that can support algal growth. It's difficult to track the fate of sinking algae. There's concern about growing too much algae, having it compete with phytoplankton and altering the food webs that rely on phytoplankton. There are biogeochemical changes in the ocean that will result from the sinking of algae. And then there are spatial concerns that massive algal farms along all our margins to do this would negatively impact fishing, like whale migrations, and the shipping industry. There's concern about the bottom of the ocean, the smothering of all that marine life on the seafloor by sinking algae, crops, or wood waste. Many people believe that if we did culture algae, it should be used for food or energy or medicines, not for putting at the bottom of the ocean, where very few organisms could use it. And there's also concerns about bringing terrestrial material into the ocean and introducing pesticides and other contaminants. So there are concerns with this approach. The injection of liquid CO2 into deep waters, or especially subsurface, which is very popular now, there are also concerns with the fact that CO2 is toxic to marine life, and it changes the pH, it lowers it. All the test systems have actually had leakage or some problems associated with them. There are changes in the properties of the sediment, and that injection can cause seismic hazards. And the other thing is many oil companies are looking at re-injecting CO2 back into their empty oil wells and reservoirs, but it basically sort of allows them to gain carbon sequestration credits while continuing to extract more fossil fuels. So there's a lot of concern associated with that. And then I'm going to skip over these other approaches because they mainly affect the coastline, direct CO2 removal from seawater, and ocean alkalinity enhancement. You may be familiar with these, but they probably at this point aren't major threats to the deep sea. So just to try to summarize the marine carbon dioxide removal methods, some of them will change light and productivity regimes. Some of them will introduce new turbidity or maybe release trace metals, cause oxygen depletion, enhance carbon dioxide, affect midwater communities, affect organic carbon in midwater, change food supply to the deep sea, lead to smothering and various kinds of changes in species interactions, probably a lot of mortality, potential anoxia on the seafloor, release of hydrogen sulfide and greenhouse gases. So, so there's definitely a lot of environmental risk associated with most of these technologies, but it's not, those risks are not getting a lot of attention. And I now want to come back and try to draw these two together, seabed mining and MCDR, and ask whether they might both be a result of what we, this expression climatism. I don't know if you've heard of this. This is where climate change mitigation becomes an overarching political goal that needs to be reached at all costs and within a certain time frame. And it often leads to the reduction of broad social, economic, and ecological policies to narrowly reframed, often numerical climate goals. So Holm and others have introduced this concept where keeping the increase in global temperature to below 1.5 or 2 degrees C creates a dangerous discourse of scarcity according to which there's not enough time to reflect, deliberate, or experiment, which can lead to poor decision making. And I would just say a couple of examples. Nauru, which invoked a 2-year rule at ISA to speed the development of regulations for mining so they could begin mining, is invoking the necessity of these minerals for combating climate change. And MCDR, of course, is directly intended to combat climate change. At the last climate negotiations, COP28, I heard many presentations arguing we need to do this, but almost no discussion of the environmental risk to the ocean or the deep sea. Ocean Visions, which is a big proponent of MCDR, says it's not a question of whether we do carbon removal, but rather where we do it. And I think that thinking, at least with seabed mining, people have raised the environmental risk issues, but that really hasn't happened yet with MCDR. There are a lot of commonalities when it comes to the deep sea. Both would be carried out over vast scales. Both occur pretty much out of sight and out of mind. People don't see it. Both pose significant environmental risks in poorly known ecosystems. Both have impacts that would not be really understood from small-scale experiments. It would require very large-scale testing. Both involve changes in marine ecosystems that are likely to affect the natural carbon cycle in many different ways that we haven't really yet identified. In both, there's a pretty blurry line between what's research, what's testing for the industry, and what is commercial deployment. We've already seen people companies begin testing that are actually deployments. They would call them tests, but they're actually mining, or they're actually depositing wood chips or whatever. We have international governance challenges in both that create social, economic, and scientific uncertainty. The ISA is regulating seabed mining in international waters. The London Convention and Protocol, and potentially the new Biodiversity Agreement, would be managing marine carbon dioxide removal in international waters. But both have, both these industries have equity issues. Lax permitting in many countries has led to initial efforts in developing countries. So we've seen mining take off in Papua New Guinea, Cook Islands, and for MCDR, there's testing in the Philippines and Namibia going on, and probably many other developing countries. So this approach could exacerbate important social inequalities. So we're at a place where industrialization of the deep ocean will bring stress from a combination of climate change and resource extraction and carbon dioxide disposal. And that's really, this is a new one. That last one is emerging. I didn't even have it on this figure originally. But I think I want to point out to this audience that deep sea science has a very important role. It needs to underpin climate and biodiversity policy to enable ocean sustainability. And I think many of you realize that we have siloed governance that affects pathways to carbon and biodiversity conservation. So we have the UNFCCC and the Paris Agreement for Climate. We have the Convention on Biological Diversity and the new Kunming-Montreal framework and the goal of 30 by 30, protecting 30% of the ocean by 2030 for biodiversity. And then we have a new biodiversity agreement for the international ocean that also includes protections. But then in terms of governance, we have the International Seabed Authority for minerals and the London Convention for climate and geoengineering research. We have the IMO for shipping and the FAO for, I don't know where that came from, for fisheries. So all of these in some way affect the deep ocean and biodiversity in the deep ocean and potentially climate remediation in the deep ocean. And then we have the IOC and the Decade for Ocean Science, which is focused on achieving the Sustainable Development Goals, is a way to bring scientists together. But making all these harmonized is a challenge. And, you know, for example, we have different organizations that have different kinds of protected areas, and they all have different criteria. So the convention, the CBD and the BBNJ agreement have developed EBSAs that could, well, CBD developed the EBSAs. They could become protected areas under the BBNJ agreement. The FAO and the regional fisheries management organizations designate vulnerable marine ecosystems as no fishing areas. The seabed mining ISA has designated APIs and other protected areas of no mining. But nobody shares criteria. They haven't harmonized this. I think the BBNJ agreement offers a great opportunity to build climate criteria alongside biodiversity protection into the design of marine protected areas. And we could be protecting areas that are important in carbon sequestration. We could protect areas where disturbance would release a lot of carbon. We could protect areas that are vulnerable to climate change. We could protect areas that are refugia from climate change. And I could go on, but there are many ways and needs to harmonize all these different types of protections. And then all these organizations also have associated with them environmental impact assessments, and we could work to harmonize and build biodiversity protection and climate change into these impact assessments. So I've been talking for a very long time. I want to just close leaving you with the idea that we need a healthy deep ocean in order to maintain biodiversity and climate on our planet, and that both deep seabed mining and marine carbon dioxide really need to be considered in terms of environmental risk to the deep ocean, and that we need to proceed with caution. And so with that, I want to thank you for listening. Thank you.